I was 54 years old when I first began to feel the quiet shift inside me. The kind that does not arrive with noise or chaos, but with a soft, almost unnoticeable change in the rhythm of your thoughts. For most of my life, I had been the kind of woman people described as dependable. I married young, built a home, raised 2 children, and did everything I believed was expected of me. I took pride in being steady, in being the person others could rely on without question. Love, as I understood it back then, was not about grand gestures or constant excitement. It was about patience. It was about compromise. It was about staying even when leaving might have been easier. I believed in that kind of love so deeply that I never stopped to ask myself what it was costing me. Over the years, my life settled into a pattern so familiar that I could move through it without thinking. Mornings began with coffee and quiet routines. Afternoons were filled with errands, chores, and the invisible labor that keeps a household running. Evenings belonged to my husband Dan, who filled the house with his loud laughter and stories that seemed to grow more exaggerated with time. From the outside, it was a good life. We had a comfortable home, 2 grown children who were doing well on their own, and a marriage that had lasted decades. There was stability and there was safety, but somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I had started to disappear inside that life. It happened so gradually that I did not notice it at first. A part of me simply grew quieter. My opinions became softer, my needs easier to ignore. I became the person who adjusted, who accommodated, who made sure everyone else was comfortable. And for a long time, I told myself that this was what love looked like. The realization that something was missing did not come all at once. It came in small moments, like a faint echo you cannot quite place. A silence that lingered longer than it should have. A feeling that something inside me was waiting, though I did not know what for. That Saturday evening, in early spring, felt like any other gathering we had hosted over the years. The air still carried a chill, but there was a promise of warmth beneath it. The kind of evening where you could sit outside with a light jacket and a glass of wine, enjoying the transition between seasons. We had invited a few friends over for dinner. Nothing elaborate, just grilled chicken, a simple salad, and a couple of bottles of red wine. It was the kind of gathering I could organize without much effort, because I had done it so many times before. Dan was in his element, moving between our guests, laughing loudly, telling stories that everyone had heard before but listened to anyway. His energy filled the patio, drawing attention to him in the way it always had. I watched him from a distance, smiling when I needed to, nodding at the right moments, playing my part in the scene we had created together over the years. I sat at the edge of the patio, my glass resting lightly in my hand, feeling both present and distant at the same time. Conversations drifted around me, overlapping and blending into a soft background noise. It was familiar, comforting in its predictability, yet strangely hollow. That was when I noticed him. Paul had been part of our circle for as long as I could remember, though he had always existed at the edges of it. He was one of Dan's oldest friends, someone who had known him long before I entered the picture. Unlike Dan, Paul was quiet, reserved, the kind of man who observed more than he spoke. He had been divorced for years and lived alone. He rarely stayed long at gatherings, often arriving late and leaving early. Our interactions had always been brief and polite, limited to small talk and occasional greetings. But that night was different. I felt his gaze before I fully registered it. When I looked up, I found him watching me from across the patio. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made me pause. He did not look away immediately, the way most people do when they are caught staring. Instead, he held my gaze for a moment longer than expected, as if he were searching for something. There was nothing inappropriate in it, nothing that crossed a line. And yet it unsettled me in a way I could not explain. Not because it made me uncomfortable, but because it made me feel seen in a way I had not felt in a very long time. I broke eye contact first, lowering my gaze to my glass. I told myself it meant nothing. Just a moment, easily dismissed, but something about it stayed with me, lingering quietly at the back of my mind. As the evening wore on, the conversations grew louder, fueled by laughter and wine. The patio felt more crowded, the air heavier with noise. I excused myself and slipped inside, grateful for the quiet of the kitchen. The lights under the cabinets cast a soft glow across the counters. The familiar routine of clearing, plates and rinsing, dishes gave me something to focus on. It was a simple grounding task, one I had performed countless times before. I moved slowly, methodically, letting the sounds from outside fade into the background. For a few moments, I allowed myself to exist without expectation, without the need to respond or engage. I did not hear him enter. His voice came from behind me, low and even. "Need a hand?" I turned quickly, startled to find Paul standing in the doorway. He leaned casually against the frame, his sleeves rolled up, a glass still in his hand. "No," I said, forcing a small smile. "I have it covered." He stepped into the room anyway, setting his glass down near the sink. There was something deliberate in the way he moved, as if he had made a quiet decision to be there. "You always do," he said. His words caught me off guard. I turned off the faucet and looked at him more carefully. "What does that mean?" He hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words. "It just seems like you are always the one taking care of everything. Hosting, cleaning, making sure everyone is comfortable." I gave a small, practiced smile. "That is what wives do." He let out a soft laugh, not unkind, but thoughtful. "No," he said, "that is what you do." The difference in his words lingered in the air between us. I did not know how to respond to that, so I turned back to the counter, picking up a towel and wiping down a surface that was already clean. "Someone has to," I said quietly. He stepped a little closer, though he kept a respectful distance. "Why does it have to be you?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The question felt simple, yet it carried a weight I was not prepared for. I had never asked myself that before. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" The words settled into me slowly, like a stone sinking beneath the surface of water. I felt my breath catch just slightly. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell him he was mistaken, that I was not pretending, that I was happy with my life. But the truth was not that simple. I turned to face him, my hands still damp from the sink. "Why are you asking me that?" He met my gaze steadily. "Because I see you." There was something in the way he said it, something quiet and certain, that made it impossible to ignore. He was not guessing. He was not projecting. He was stating something he believed to be true. And for reasons I could not fully explain, it affected me more than I wanted it to. From outside, someone called Dan's name, breaking the moment. The sound snapped me back into reality. Paul stepped back, picking up his glass. "I will let you finish," he said. "Good night." He left the kitchen without another word, and I stood there alone, the quiet suddenly feeling heavier than before. I returned to the dishes, but my movements were slower now, less certain. His words echoed in my mind, repeating themselves in a way I could not turn off. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" I did not have an answer for that. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, I felt the question take root inside me. The next morning, I told myself nothing had changed. I moved through my routine the way I always did, as if the quiet shift from the night before had been nothing, more than a passing thought. I woke early, made coffee, and stood by the kitchen window, watching the pale light of morning stretch across the yard. The air still held a trace of that early spring chill, and the trees swayed gently in a breeze that felt almost hesitant, as if the season itself had not fully decided to arrive. Dan sat at the table, flipping through his phone, occasionally muttering something about the news or the neighborhood. He spoke about trimming the hedges before the Homeowners Association sent another email, his tone half amused, half irritated. I nodded at the right moments, adding small responses when expected, playing my role with the ease that comes from years of repetition. On the surface, everything was exactly as it had always been. But underneath, something had shifted. Paul's words lingered in my mind, not loudly, not insistently, but persistently. They wove themselves into the quiet spaces of my thoughts, appearing in moments when I least expected them. As I rinsed my coffee cup, as I folded laundry, as I walked from one room to another, they were there. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" I had spent so many years believing that I was not pretending at all, that I was simply living the life I had chosen, fulfilling the responsibilities I had accepted. But now, when I let myself sit with the question, even for a moment, I felt something uncomfortable begin to surface. It was not regret, not exactly. It was something quieter than that, a recognition perhaps, a realization that somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking myself what I needed. Instead, I had learned to anticipate what everyone else needed, and I had shaped myself around that. The thought unsettled me, so I pushed it aside. I told myself I was overthinking, that one conversation, one unexpected moment, did not have the power to change anything real. Life was not that fragile. It did not unravel so easily. And yet, as the day went on, I found it harder to settle back into the comfort of my routines. Every task felt slightly different, as if I were seeing it from a small distance. The familiarity was still there, but it no longer felt as solid as it once had. It was as though I had stepped just outside of my own life and was observing it from a new angle. I did not see Paul for 2 days. In that time, I tried to convince myself that the space was a good thing. That distance would restore clarity, that whatever had stirred inside me would settle back into stillness. But clarity did not come. Instead, the silence gave my thoughts more room to move. It allowed questions to form that I had not given myself permission to ask before. Was I happy? The question felt almost disloyal. I had a good marriage by most standards. Dan was not cruel or neglectful in any obvious way. He was simply who he had always been, comfortable, predictable, set in his ways, and for years I had matched that energy, building a life that was stable, if not particularly exciting. So why did I feel this quiet restlessness now? Why did a simple conversation with a man I barely knew seem to echo more loudly than the countless conversations I had shared with my own husband?
On the third day, Dan mentioned that Paul would be coming over to help him move a bookshelf in the garage. The moment he said it, I felt something tighten in my chest. I kept my expression neutral, nodding as if it meant nothing. But inside, there was a flicker of anticipation I could not ignore. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I spent that morning finding reasons to stay busy in parts of the house, far from the garage. I reorganized the linen closet, folded towels that did not need folding, and wiped down surfaces that were already clean. From down the hall, I could hear their voices, the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor, the low murmur of conversation occasionally interrupted by Dan's laughter. It all felt normal. And yet I was acutely aware of his presence in a way that felt anything but normal. At one point, I passed through the hallway, intending to go from one room to another. I told myself it was incidental, that I was not looking for him. But he was there. Paul stood near the front door, his keys in his hand, as if he had just finished helping and was about to leave. He looked up when he saw me, his expression calm but attentive. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a small nod. "Thanks for the coffee," he said. His voice was steady, polite, as though nothing unusual had ever passed between us. I paused, forcing myself to match that tone. "Did you get any cake?" He shook his head slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. "No, I think Dan kept it for himself." There was something familiar in the exchange, something almost comforting in its simplicity. It allowed me to step back into safer territory, where nothing needed to be acknowledged. "There is a slice left," I said. "I can wrap it for you." I moved toward the kitchen before he could respond, aware of my own urgency. I needed something to do, something to occupy my hands and steady my thoughts. I found the leftover cake and reached for the foil, focusing on the small, precise movements of wrapping it. But despite my efforts, I could feel the tension in my fingers, the slight tremor I could not fully control. He stepped into the kitchen a moment later. The space between us felt smaller this time, more charged, even though neither of us had done anything to change it. "You are close again," he said quietly. I stopped what I was doing, his words pulling my attention back to him. I did not immediately understand what he meant. "Close to what?" He met my gaze, and for a moment the room felt very still, close to pretending everything is fine. The simplicity of his words made them harder to dismiss. I let out a slow breath, setting the foil down. "You have been on my mind," he added. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I looked down at the counter, searching for a response that would create distance, that would reestablish the boundaries I knew should be there. "I'm not sure what to say to that," I admitted. "You do not have to say anything," he replied.
But I knew that silence in this moment carried its own meaning. I lifted my eyes to meet his again. For the first time, I really looked at him. He was not a man who drew attention in obvious ways. There was nothing particularly striking about his appearance. His hair had begun to gray, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of years lived fully, if not always easily. But there was something in the way he looked at me. It was not casual, not distracted. It was intentional, as if he were trying to understand something, or perhaps remind me of something I had forgotten. "Paul," I said slowly, "this is not a good idea." He nodded, as though he had expected that response. "I know. Then why say anything at all?" He hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of care. Because I cannot keep pretending either. His words settled into the space between us, quiet but undeniable. There it was again, that same theme, pretending, as if we had both been living behind something invisible, something we had never named until now. I felt a tightening in my chest, a mixture of emotions I could not easily separate. Fear, curiosity, recognition. I picked up the wrapped cake and handed it to him, using the gesture as a way to create distance. "You should go," I said softly. He accepted it without argument. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something more, but he did not. Instead, he gave a small nod and turned toward the door. "Goodbye, Maggie." The way he said my name was quiet, but it carried a weight that lingered long after he was gone. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, listening to the sound of the front door closing, to the fading echo of footsteps, to the return of the familiar silence. But it was not the same silence as before. That night, I lay in bed beside Dan, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of light filtering in from the street. Dan's breathing was steady, deep, the kind of sleep that comes easily when there is nothing weighing on your mind. I envied that. I turned onto my side, watching the outline of his face in the dim light. There had been a time when I knew every expression, every shift in his mood. When our conversations felt effortless, when our connection felt alive. Now it felt distant, not broken, but muted, as if something essential had faded over time, replaced by habit and routine. I wondered when that had happened. I wondered if it had been gradual, like everything else, so slow that neither of us had noticed. And then my thoughts drifted back to Paul, to the way he had looked at me, to the way he had spoken, not with urgency or pressure, but with a quiet certainty that made it impossible to ignore. "Because I see you." The words echoed in my mind, intertwining with my own unspoken thoughts. What did it mean to be seen? And why had I not realized how much I missed that feeling until now? I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Instead, I lay there, suspended between two versions of my life. The one I had built over decades, safe, predictable, familiar, and the one that had just begun to reveal itself, uncertain, unsteady, but undeniably real. I did not know where any of this would lead. I only knew that something had already begun, and I was no longer sure I wanted to stop it. The days that followed did not unravel all at once. There was no sudden decision, no dramatic turning point where everything changed in a single moment. Instead, it felt like walking along a narrow path where each step mattered, even when it seemed small. I went back to my routines, or at least I tried to. I did the grocery shopping, moving through the aisles with a list in my hand, placing items into the cart out of habit more than thought. I paid the bills, answered a call from my daughter about her promotion, listened carefully, asked the right questions, told her how proud I was. All the pieces of my life remained intact, arranged neatly as they always had been. But underneath, something was different. It was not loud or disruptive. It was quieter than that, a steady awareness that followed me from one moment to the next. A feeling that I was no longer entirely present in the life I had built. Even as I continued to live it, I began to notice things I had not paid attention to before. The way silence filled the house in the afternoons, stretching across the rooms like something tangible. The way Dan and I spoke to each other. Not unkindly, but without depth. Our conversations reduced to logistics and small observations about the day. The way I moved from task to task without ever stopping to ask myself whether any of it still mattered to me. It was not that my life was unhappy. It was that it felt incomplete. A week passed without seeing Paul. At first, I told myself that the distance was necessary, that whatever had begun between us, even in the smallest sense, needed space to fade. That time would return everything to normal. But normal no longer felt the same. Instead of bringing clarity, the absence only made my thoughts louder. It gave me more time to sit with the questions that had begun to form inside me. I found myself replaying our conversations, not because I wanted to hold on to them, but because they had awakened something I could not easily ignore. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" "Because I see you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that pressed against everything. I thought I understood about myself. I had spent years being the person others needed me to be. I had shaped my life around responsibility, around stability, around the quiet pride of being dependable. But I had never asked myself what it meant to feel alive. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. One afternoon, as I stood folding towels in the laundry room, The thought came to me so suddenly that I had to stop what I was doing. How long has it been since I felt seen? Not appreciated. Not needed. Seen. The difference felt important, though I struggled to explain it, even to myself. Being needed was something I understood. It was something I had built my identity around. But being seen was something else entirely. It was about being recognized not for what you do, but for who you are beneath it all. And I was not sure I remembered what that felt like anymore. The realization stayed with me long after I left the laundry room. That evening, I found myself sitting in the living room with the television on. Though I was not really watching it, Dan sat beside me, focused on the screen, occasionally commenting on something in the program. I responded when appropriate, but my attention drifted. I looked at him then, really looked at him, the way I had not in a long time. There was nothing unfamiliar about him. His features, his expressions, even the way he sat were all deeply known to me. And yet, there was a distance there that I could not ignore. Not a physical distance, but something quieter. Something that had settled between us over the years without either of us noticing. I wondered if he felt it too, or if he was content with the way things were. The thought brought a small ache with it. Not resentment, not anger, just a quiet sadness. The next day, the message came. It was simple. I will be near your neighborhood later. Could we talk? I stared at the screen for longer than I should have. My first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend I had not seen it, to let the moment pass without response. It would have been the safer choice, the easier one. But my hand did not move away from the phone. Instead, it hovered there, caught between hesitation and something else I could not quite name. I knew what this was, or at least I knew what it could become, and that knowledge should have been enough to stop me. But it was not. After a long moment, I typed a response. Yes, just for a bit. The words felt small, almost insignificant. But as soon as I sent them, I knew they were not. We agreed to meet at the park down the road, not at the main entrance, but along a smaller trail that wound through the trees. It was a quiet place, one people rarely visited unless they were looking for solitude. It felt appropriate. The sky was overcast when I arrived, the kind of gray that seemed to press down gently on everything beneath it. A light drizzle had begun, soft enough that it barely registered at first. I parked under a cluster of tall pines, their branches offering some shelter from the rain. For a moment, I stayed in the car, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I could still leave. The thought came to me clearly, offering a final chance to turn back. But I did not take it. Instead, I stepped out of the car and closed the door behind me. Paul was already there, leaning against his car a short distance away. He straightened when he saw me, his expression calm, though there was a tiredness in his eyes that I had not noticed before. We did not speak right away. Instead, we began to walk. The trail curved gently through the trees, the ground soft beneath our feet. The sound of the rain filtered through the leaves above us, creating a quiet rhythm that filled the space between us. For a while, that was enough. Finally, he spoke. I am not trying to cause problems, Maggie. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something careful. I know, I replied. And I did. That was what made it more complicated. This was not reckless, not impulsive. It was something quieter, something that had grown out of recognition rather than intention. But I cannot ignore this anymore, he continued. And I do not think you can either. I stopped walking. The words settled between us, asking to be acknowledged. I turned to face him. What is this to you? The question felt necessary. If I was going to stand here, if I was going to allow this moment to exist, I needed to understand what it meant. He met my gaze without hesitation. It is not about wanting something I should not have, he said. He paused as if choosing his words carefully. It is about seeing someone who has been invisible for too long. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. It was not dramatic, not exaggerated. It was simple, and it was real. It is about wanting you to remember that you are still alive. The words landed somewhere deep inside me, in a place I had not allowed myself to visit in years. I felt my throat tighten, my breath catch just slightly. Not because I was upset, but because I recognized the truth in what he was saying. I had not thought of myself as invisible. But standing there, hearing those words, I realized that in many ways I had been. Not to the world, but to myself. I looked away, blinking back the sudden sting in my eyes. I do not know what to do, I said quietly. He nodded as if he had expected that. You do not have to decide anything right now. There was no pressure in his voice, no expectation, just a quiet understanding. I just needed you to know that someone sees you, that someone cares, The simplicity of it broke something open inside me, not in a way that felt overwhelming, but in a way that felt undeniable. We continued walking, though neither of us spoke for a while. Eventually, we came to a bench tucked beneath a canopy of trees. The leaves above us shielded us from most of the rain, allowing only the occasional drop to fall through. We sat down, leaving a small space between us. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It felt honest. For the first time in a long time, I was not trying to fill the space with words or actions. I was simply there, present in the moment, aware of everything I was feeling without trying to push it away. Paul did not move closer. He did not reach for my hand or try to close the distance between us. He simply sat beside me, and somehow that mattered more than anything else. It was not about crossing a line. It was about being seen without expectation, about being understood without explanation. I let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. For a brief moment, everything felt still. Not perfect, not resolved, but real. After a while, he stood. I looked up at him, not quite ready for the moment to end. "Whatever happens next," he said, "just be true to yourself." The words were simple, but they carried a weight I could feel settle into me. He did not wait for a response. Instead, he gave a small nod and turned back toward the trail. I watched him walk away, his figure gradually disappearing through the trees. As the rain began to fall a little harder, when he reached his car, he did not look back, and then he was gone. I remained on the bench for a long time after that. The rain continued steady and soft, blending with the quiet sounds of the forest around me. I sat there, my hands resting in my lap, my thoughts moving slowly through everything that had just happened. Nothing had been decided, nothing had been resolved, and yet everything felt different. I realized then that this was not about him, not entirely. It was about me, about the parts of myself I had set aside, about the questions I had avoided, about the life I had built, and whether I was still fully present within it. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to sit with those questions without turning away. And as I did, I felt something unfamiliar begin to take shape inside me. Not certainty, not clarity, but awareness. And I knew, even then, that there was no going back to the way things had been before. The morning after my walk with Paul, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than I had in years. At first I told myself I was just tired, that the heaviness in my chest, the unfamiliar rhythm of my thoughts, was nothing more than the result of a restless night. But as I looked at my reflection, I realized it was something else entirely. I did not look different. The same lines framed my face. The same faint shadows rested beneath my eyes. Time had left its marks, as it always does, quietly and without apology. But there was something beneath all of that, something I had not allowed myself to notice before. I was not just looking at my reflection. I was seeing myself, not as a wife, not as a mother, not as the woman who kept everything in order, just me. The realization was both unsettling and strangely grounding. For years I had moved through my life without pausing, long enough to ask who I was beneath, the roles I had taken on. I had become so accustomed to being needed that I had forgotten what it meant to simply exist as myself. That morning I did something small, but significant. I did nothing. I did not rush into the kitchen to clean up from the night before. I did not start a load of laundry or make a list of tasks that needed to be completed. Instead, I made a cup of tea and stepped out onto the back porch. The air was cool, carrying the lingering scent of rain. The trees swayed gently, their leaves catching the early light. It was quiet in a way that felt different from the usual silence of the house. This silence was not empty. It was full. I sat down and wrapped my hands around the warm cup, letting myself be still. Not because I had earned it, not because everything else had been taken care of, but simply because I chose to. At first it felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. My mind kept trying to return to its usual patterns, reminding me of the things I should be doing, the responsibilities waiting inside. But I did not move. I stayed where I was, and slowly, the noise inside my head began to settle. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel everything I had been holding back: the quiet exhaustion, the unspoken loneliness, the subtle ache of realizing how much of myself I had set aside over the years. But alongside those feelings, there was something else. A sense of possibility. It was faint, almost fragile, but it was there. The sound of the back door opening pulled me from my thoughts. Dan stepped outside, squinting slightly in the morning light. He looked at me with mild curiosity, as if trying to understand why I was sitting there instead of moving through my usual routine. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, offering a small, genuine smile. "Yeah, just thinking." He accepted the answer without question, nodding once before turning back toward the house. For a moment, I watched him go. There was no anger in me, no resentment, just a quiet realization. We had both settled into a version of our lives that no longer required us to truly see each other. We had become comfortable in the spaces we occupied, moving alongside one another without ever really connecting in the way we once had. And maybe neither of us had noticed how much had been lost along the way. That evening, I made a decision, not a dramatic one, not something that would immediately change everything, but something necessary. After dinner, as Dan settled into his usual spot in front of the television, I stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering my thoughts. Then I walked over and turned off the screen. He looked up at me, surprised. "What are you doing?" "We need to talk," I said. My voice was steady, though my heart was not. He muted the television, giving me his full attention in a way that felt unfamiliar. I sat down across from him, taking a slow breath before speaking. "I do not know when it happened," I began, but somewhere along the way, I started to feel like I disappeared. The words felt heavy, but once they were out, I could not take them back. He frowned slightly, confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" I held his gaze, forcing myself to stay present in the moment. "I mean that I have spent so much time taking care of everything, of everyone, that I am not even sure who I am anymore." The honesty in my voice surprised even me. "I am tired, Dan, and I feel alone." The room fell quiet. For a moment, he did not respond. He simply looked at me as if trying to process what I had said. Then something shifted in his expression. "I did not know you felt that way," he said. There was no defensiveness in his tone, no anger. Just a quiet admission. "That is the problem," I replied softly. "You did not ask." The words were not meant to hurt him, but they were true. We had both stopped asking each other the questions that mattered. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between us. Finally, he spoke again. "Is there someone else?" The question was direct but not accusatory. I could have lied. It would have been easy. It would have spared us both the discomfort of facing what had begun to take shape beneath the surface. But I did not. I shook my head slowly. "No, not like that." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "But there is someone who reminded me what it feels like to be seen." His jaw tightened slightly, but he did not interrupt. "Maybe I stopped seeing you too," he said after a moment. The honesty in his response caught me off guard. We had spent so much time existing side by side that I had not expected him to meet me in this moment with anything other than resistance. That night, we did not argue. We did not raise our voices or revisit old grievances. Instead, we sat there, two people who had once known each other deeply, trying to find our way back to something that had been lost. It was not easy. There were long pauses, unanswered questions, moments where neither of us knew what to say. But there was also something else. Effort. In the days that followed, we began to talk more. Not just about practical things, but about ourselves. About what we wanted, what we had missed, what we had taken for granted. We agreed to counseling, something we had never considered before. It felt strange at first, opening up to someone else about the parts of our marriage we had kept hidden, even from each other. But slowly it began to help. We started asking questions we had not asked in years. What makes you feel alive? What do you need from me? What have we lost, and can we find it again? The answers were not always clear. Sometimes they were uncomfortable, but they were honest, and that mattered more than anything else. As for Paul, I did not see him again after that day in the park. Not because something dramatic happened, but because I understood what he had given me. It was not a relationship. It was a reflection. He had held up a mirror and allowed me to see the parts of myself I had been ignoring for far too long, and once I saw them, I could not unsee them. There were moments when I thought about him, not with longing, but with a quiet sense of gratitude. He had not asked anything of me. He had not tried to take anything that was not his. He had simply reminded me that I existed beyond the life I had built, that I was still capable of feeling, of wanting, of being more than the roles I had accepted. And that realization changed everything. Months passed. Not everything became perfect. There were still moments of distance, still habits that were hard to break, but there was also progress. Small, meaningful changes that built over time. Dan began to notice things he had overlooked before. I began to speak up in ways I had not allowed myself to. We found moments of connection that had been missing for years, and slowly something began to return. Not the version of our relationship that had existed in the past, but something new, something more intentional, more aware, more real. One evening, as I sat on the back porch again, watching the sun dip below the trees, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer ignoring myself. I had spent so many years believing that love meant staying, no matter what. And in some ways I still believed that. But now I understood something I had not before. Staying only matters if you are not losing yourself in the process, if you are not disappearing piece by piece until there is nothing left of who you once were. Love is not just about being there for someone else. It is also about being there for yourself, about recognizing your own needs, your own desires, your own sense of identity, and honoring them. As the evening light faded, I took a slow breath, feeling a quiet strength settle within me. I did not have all the answers. I did not know exactly what the future would look like, but for the first time in a long time, I felt present in my own life. Awake, and that more than anything else felt like the beginning of something real.